In this episode, filmed on location in Bodh, Kathmandu, I am joined by Dorje, an American Vajrayana practitioner born in 1947. Dorje recounts his childhood in the American South, his move to San Francisco in 1968, and his involvement in the early days of the gay liberation movement. He recalls the arrival of AIDS in 1981, the traumatic deaths of his close friends, and the impact of his own HIV diagnosis. Dorje explains his conversion to Buddhism in the midst of a chaotic and stressful life, his 25 years as an ordained monk, the power of the Yamantaka practice, and his understanding of the spiritual path. Dorje also explores the deep relevance of the core teachings of Buddhism to his experience of the AIDS crisis, describes the rhythms of grief and death, and shares what he has learned about helping the dying. So without further ado, Dorje. Dorje, I'm curious if you can say something about the context of your upbringing.
Oh, well, I'm from the South. I grew up in a small town in Mississippi where my family had been for quite some time. And we moved to Atlanta when I was a child, which was quite different. And I grew up in Atlanta as much as I did.
And what did you have, how can I put it, what was the economic situation and of your family at that time?
Comfortable. We lived in the suburbs, the very edge of the suburbs. Atlanta was growing, it's still growing. But for example, the high school that I went to, about half the kids were suburbanites like me, and the other half were from families that had lived there for a very, very long time. It was a mix of folk.
And what sort of a boy were you, if we could peer back in time?
What sort of boy?
Were you, yeah. What were your interests in? What was your character and personality like in those days?
I was bookish. I was good at school. I studied a lot. I enjoyed that. I was rather a proto-hippie, I guess you would say. Me and a few of my friends were the first to listen to folk music a lot, like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and so on. This was in the early to mid-'60s.
When were you born? When were you born?
47. Yes, at the beginning of the baby boom.
And how did you think your life was going to go in those days? If we were to talk to the boy or the teenager, what ideas would he have had about how your life would have gone?
That's a good question. I don't remember really, although I do remember being not terribly enthused about the potentials, the options that seemed to be available at the time.
Which were, to your mind?
Doctor, lawyer, sales, marketing, corporate work, and so on. Not the kind of thing that grabs a teenager. But interestingly, I wound up being a lawyer anyhow. Yeah. And further, I remember exactly when I took one of those aptitude tests when I was in high school, and it said I should be a minister. And I thought that was completely ridiculous at the time. And here I am.
So tell me about the law you practiced. You went to college, I guess, and qualified and so on.
Oh, there's more before that. It's okay. I went to San Francisco in '68 because that's what everybody did then. I arrived on my 21st birthday. I traveled across the country with some friends, my brother, but they went back and I stayed for 7 or 8 years. I got very involved in politics. I had been involved in what do they call it? In movement politics at the time, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement. Atlanta was sort of the hub of the civil rights movement. People would come through on the way from the north to go out to the country to do voter registration and whatnot. And they would return shell-shocked. It wasn't at all what these poor Yankee students were expecting in several different ways. In some ways it was better than what they thought, in some ways it was much worse. But at any rate, I was involved with SNCC, Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, and later on SOC, Southern Students Organizing Committee, which was, white people were kind of encouraged to get out of SNCC, and so many of them went there. And then the anti-war movement happened. I was quite involved in that since it affected me almost directly. So many of my friends were either being drafted or trying to get out of the draft, and my brother too. So when I came to San Francisco, I came out, I would say I oozed out, because it was, at the time it was, all the stereotypes and identities were something that people wanted to avoid. And we were all, the zeitgeist of the time was to develop your own identity, your own genius, your own creativity, or whatever it is. And so identifying as anything was kind of not encouraged. So that was the beginning of the gay liberation movement. I got involved actually shortly before Stonewall. There was Stonewall, which happened in 69, I believe, June of 69, was a riot in New York when gay people fought back, gay men fought back, and trans people, drag queens as they were called, fought back when the police raided a bar. And that's reckoned to be the beginning of the modern gay movement. However, for those of us in California, we would take issue with that since there were so many things going on there. But like they say in California these days, Stonewall wasn't the wave. It was the crest of the wave, but it wasn't the wave. There'd already been a riot of street drag queens. There'd been, a friend of mine had been fired from his job with a steamship company for being gay, and that became a cause célèbre, got a lot of media attention. There was an incident in LA that got a lot of attention too. Once one of the editors, or a columnist in one of the newspapers, mentioned something homophobic, and so we all went down there to protest and had a little picket line and so on. And the printers were up on the roof, and they started pouring lavender ink on us. And so we put our hands in the ink and pressed it against the wall, so there were little handprints all up and down the wall. And that kind of became a symbol for the gay movement for a while, at least in San Francisco. Replaced by many other things like the pink triangle and now the rainbow flag. So it was quite heady. It was something new that I'd never done before, that nobody had ever done before. And the first folks who were really accepting of us was the left, and they kind of struggled with it a lot. We had a gay contingent in one of the massive anti-war demonstrations, the ones that were 100,000 people, that were among the first really big ones. And that was new. Nobody really knew quite what to make of us. Some people thought it was a lifestyle thing and not really along the lines of a discrete oppressed minority like black folks or like people in colonialist countries and so on. But finally, slowly, things got more accepting. Personally, it was, there were so many things like that going on. Probably the one that was most interesting was something called the Cockettes. It was a theater group that kind of started spontaneously with people just dressing up in whatever they had. The story that they like to tell is that in San Francisco, they performed at midnight at the Palace Theater on Fridays and Saturdays, I think it was, when they had a midnight showing. And the Palace Theater was also the place where the Chinese opera was performed when they came to town. And so there was a trunk there full of costumes that somehow or another disappeared. And the product was a Cockette production of Madame Butterfly in one of the alleys in Chinatown. The Chinese just cracked up. They thought it was hilarious. So it sort of came out of the street theater, the guerrilla theater that was also happening then. And I was involved with them for quite a bit while trying to go to art school at the same time. Probably one of the most interesting things that happened, or the most high-profile thing that happened, was when it was announced that Tricia Nixon, President Nixon's daughter, was going to be married. That day, the decision was made to make a movie of the wedding that premiered on the day that she was married, called Tricia's Wedding. And of course, she was played by a 6'3" drag queen, and so on. It was fun. It was not professional at all, but people loved it. Google it. A documentary was done, shown at Sundance, did well, maybe 20 years ago, I think. So that was a long time ago. That was 50 years ago. The Cockettes were thought to be important because they sort of paved the way for a number of things. One was glitter rock. Another was the way drag has been mainstreamed. There was never really outrageous drag like that before. Drag that shocked, drag that made a statement of some kind. That took on popular culture and kind of subverted it with, to make a long story short. So that's what I did. And I got a degree in film and photography at San Francisco Art Institute. I went back to Atlanta. Not much was happening then. So I kind of decided to make things happen and got very involved in doing a lot of gay political organizing, or lesbian gay political organizing, as it was called then. And there were, I started a couple of organizations. Probably the one that was most successful was one that started out as a gay democratic group that we tried to be affiliated with the Democratic Party. They didn't want us. But, so that didn't matter. We went off on our own anyhow. And we were the first to do, to try to get out the gay vote, to try to build a gay vote. We did that with candidates forums and interviewing the candidates and endorsing and supporting candidates. And that's pretty much how I spent the next few years, as well as practicing law. There were some other organizations too, like a gay center and a few other things, but that was my main focus. And that was basically what I learned, that if you eat enough rubber chicken dinners and if you support enough candidates and campaigns, then after a while you can go back and ask them to do something and they'll do it, like say pass Atlanta's anti-discrimination ordinances, or have it amended so that it included sexual orientation. And I also lobbied the General Assembly, our state legislature, on AIDS issues when it came along. When AIDS came, I was editor of a gay newspaper called the Gazette in Atlanta, weekly giveaway. And so I kind of was more aware of it than most people were, since I was, in a place to get all the national news and otherwise. Can I take it?
Of course, yeah.
So when AIDS came, in 81, I think it was, I was among the very first to realize that it was awful, at least the first in my circle. And not just that it was going to be awful, but that it was going to be horrible. I remember very well sitting down with a pocket calculator, and the number of cases or deaths, I don't remember which, was doubling every 6 months, I believe it was. And so I figured out that by the early 90s, hundreds of thousands of gay men would be dead. And that came to pass, but nobody really wanted to believe it, not in the gay community, and straight folks were just not that interested. I felt like that Trojan princess named Cassandra, who was given the gift of prophecy, I think by Apollo, and she could see the future. And however, one of the other gods, maybe Hera, had it in for her, didn't like her, so she couldn't take away the gift of prophecy, but she made another curse so that no one would believe her. That's what it was like. That's exactly what it was like. And it was awful. And then it got closer and closer. That is, I knew that one of the very first people to get in Atlanta to get sick and die, he was a bartender, and we would have dated, except he didn't get off to work until 4 a.m. when the bars closed, so that kind of left that out. So he was a good friend. He died, and eventually all of my friends, my close friends, died, except for one. And so I have no old gay male friends except for him. Everybody else died, which was, it's really hard to words. I don't have the words for what it was like. Maybe other people do, but I was diagnosed in '85. It was shortly after the test came out. You get to a place that's beyond hope and that's beyond despair, that stays with you. You become aware of one's own mortality and the inevitability of death and change. So I was practicing law by that time and was the first lawyer in Atlanta who did much with HIV/AIDS related legal work, which covered the waterfront, not just wills and estates and anti-discrimination and insurance and healthcare issues and property issues and so on. And yeah, so it was quite something, quite stressful. You know, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross outlined these 5 issues that happen when we die, or when we think we're going to die, or when a loved one dies, or when we have any kind of loss, like a handicap or losing a job. And that became really clear on a huge societal level. That is, people in the gay community were just, it became so clear to me, but not others. Of course, their denial, and which would manifest as someone having a perfect anti-discrimination case, complete with a smoking gun, everything in writing, but they would say, no, I wasn't discriminated against. Like they say, I was fired because of this. And these people really aren't treating me this way, when they were. And anger. People were quite angry, and I had a client who would, like, every few weeks he would come in and change his will because he was angry with some relative or another, and was leaving his salt and pepper shaker collection to this person or that person. I finally had to start charging him for it a lot. And there's bargaining. Some people say these are phases that people go through, but I don't really think it's that way. Others say it's not, and I agree with them. There are these 5 issues that people sort of live in, and I think we bring to it whatever it is that we have. And my thing that I was bringing to it was bargaining, and that worked. That's what lobbying is about, what doing politics is about. So I lobbied our General Assembly, our state legislature on HIV/AIDS related legislation in the mid to late 80s mostly, and a lot of it was trying to kill really bad legislation that was ill thought out, since AIDS paranoia was at its height then, and Georgia is not the most progressive of states, so some really bad things we scuttled, some like mandatory testing for everybody who, not everybody, but people say who were arrested for anything sex related, people who were getting married, pregnant women, and so on. The Right to Life ladies became my friends on that one because, of course, I went to them, I said, if these women are pregnant, they're just going to kill those babies. And they agreed with me, and they kind of helped me do a few things with it. But politics is like that. That is, they say it makes strange bedfellows, and it's certainly true. And one tends to have to stay focused on whatever it is that you're doing, because in a legislature, there's a seamless web of alliances and adversaries that's always shifting, and depending on the issue, you kind of have to know what's going on all the time and focus and if you're going to get your legislation killed or some bad ones, get your legislation passed or some bad ones killed, or get some money appropriated. And that's all that you do. So it was during that time that my youthful fervor kind of went by the boards. That is, I was quite a passionate activist, but as I got more involved in what I call realpolitik, you just wind up having to work with people who are very different from you, and setting aside your differences to work on common goals. And you kind of set aside all sorts of things. I wouldn't say I became a hired gun, but I became much more cerebral and very, well, one of my friends said that someone who was lobbied with an organization, she said I was one of the most relentless people there. And what she meant was ruthless, and she meant it as a compliment. But I excuse myself because, you see, in politics there are two things that really matter. One is votes and one is money. And it's good to have both of them, but having one is kind of necessary. We had neither. I had nothing but my brain, and I did whatever I could. And that's probably the part of my pre-Buddhist, pre-monk life that I am proudest of, because I felt like I made a greater contribution doing that than anything else. I ran for office. I was the first openly gay person to run for any political office in Georgia, and I ran for the state house in a county-wide seat that was encompassed a vast number of people. Mostly I ran because I'd always wanted to, and I wanted to do it before I got sick, as I thought would be inevitable. And also I wanted to be able to demonstrate where there was a gay vote, and to be able to show folk the printouts and say, we're here, and so on. So those two things were where I ran. I didn't win, and it's probably just as well, since I'm ill-suited for, I don't have the temperament to be a legislator. I was more of an activist always. And so Buddha Dharma came along about that time in a couple of ways. One is being focused with one-pointed concentration on your piece of legislation that you're getting through, and kind of not just, well, you have to know, if possible, about everything anybody else is doing, because that could impact you. Or say, for example, you have to know what's important to the various legislators, such as agriculture, forestry, education, healthcare. You have to know these things, and you have to know what bills are up and important to them at the time. And so, and you can easily get distracted and get off on somebody else's agenda. So learning how to focus was it. And at the end of the day, what you have, you get money appropriated, or you kill bad bills, or you get good bills passed. And that's it. That's all you do. And it's quite rewarding. It's kind of an acquired taste. It's the kind of thing that you kind of lie in bed at night and chuckle to yourself and think how clever you are, or were. It's those folks who do that work. The progressive advocates are some of the greatest unsung heroes, along with progressive lawyers, especially in the South, who kind of implemented all of the civil rights legislation that was passed in the early 60s, the Great Society, the Voting Rights Act, and so on. I practiced with a law firm with those folks. They were kind of a generation older than me. And I learned a lot from them. They were my idols, my mentors, my heroes. They went on, some of them, it was a wild and crazy group of folk. It was a legal collective in the early 80s. So I got into Buddha Dharma then. I read it, a lot of it, when I was a teenager, especially what was available, that is to say, D.T. Suzuki and Evans-Wentz, who kind of, well, there have been better translations and better explanations of the Dharma since then, more accurate, but that was what was available, and I ate it up, along with Kerouac and Burroughs and Jean Genet and other things that teenagers were reading back then. So when AIDS came, nothing else really made sense. That is, there were, I didn't find any consolation in Christianity, of course, because most, the ministers there were saying that AIDS was God's punishment for homosexuality, ignoring the fact that lesbians almost never get it sexually. And, you know, I'd be happy to be a lesbian, but I just don't have the fixtures for it. So God punished me, according to these folk. And the other religions didn't really speak to me, but with Buddha Dharma, there were two things that worked. One was the way that the philosophical aspect, and one was the practical aspect, that is meditation. My life was a mess. It was like being in the middle of a hurricane, a storm that was raging. Everybody was dying. I was going to die, I thought. I've been sick from HIV only once, and that was a cancer that I got over. Unlike most of my friends. So meditating, Shamata was the first one that we do in Buddha Dharma, was like creating a little eye in the middle of the hurricane, and it spread and spread and spread. And for me, after a few weeks of doing it, I noticed how it was affecting my off-the-cushion life, or my as I call it, my post-meditative life. My work, that is, as I said, being an attorney is quite stressful. Doing advocacy for HIV, AIDS-related and gay issues too, and a deeply homophobic and AIDS-phobic culture was rather stressful also. But nonetheless, it helped me a lot just to chill out and to take a look at things and not to identify so much with what I was doing, which was a good thing, because one of the mistakes that a lot of people make, like me, when one's an advocate or one is an enthusiastic, true believer, when you get involved in something like that, it can work against you. That is, it clouds your vision, clouds your thinking. And so you have to step back and take into consideration everything that's going on and play it as it is. So that's, Buddha Dharma worked. There was only one thing going on in Atlanta at the time, or two things. One was a Soto Zen Center, and the other was Shambhala, Trigger Trungpa's organization. So I went to both for a while, and then a Galupa group came to town and started an organization that's flourishing from draped from the Losling Monastery. And I really liked that because it was the real deal. They were monks who were geshes, there were others who were very well educated, very experienced monks. And also a thing about Tibetan Buddhism that I liked a lot was that in Buddhism, in the West, when some new movement comes along, a lot of it is about refuting what came before. And the emphasis is on separating yourself from whatever came before, such as Christianity and Judaism, and the conflicts there are obvious, or Protestantism and Catholicism, and so on. But in Buddhism, we take a more holistic approach. There were three major branches of Buddhism. The first was It's called Hinayana, and we still practice it in the Tibetan tradition. So each one builds on the other, and the notion is that yes, that's true and good, but there's more to it, and so more to it comes along. And of course, in Mahayana, its focus is said to be more on compassion, and then in Vajrayana, the third one, or Tibetan Buddhism, Himalayan Buddhism, it's on transformation. A lot of it's about transforming suffering, transforming our afflictive emotions into something that's working for us. So each one of them is necessary too, and I like that a lot. So the Tibetan Buddhists appeal to me quite a bit. On a different level, what resonated with me was the story of the Buddha and how he was a prince, and it was predicted that, well, for all of you watching this, I'm sure you've heard this before, but think of it as a review. He lived in what's now Nepal, or was born in what's now Nepal, grew up in what's now India, and he had when he was born, a prophecy was made that he would either be a Chakravartin, a ruler of the world, or he would be a great sage. And his father, of course, wanted him to follow him and to be a Chakravartin, a ruler of the world, a greater king than he was. So he made his life pleasant. He had 3 palaces for each of the 3 seasons in India. He had music. He never knew suffering. When it came time for him to marry, all the most beautiful women in the country were called forth, and he chose one. And then the story goes, one day he heard one of the women in the palace singing a sad song about her homeland, her country. And this surprised him, since he didn't know about sadness. And he asked, it intrigued him. He wanted to know more. And he asked various people. He wound up going out with his charioteer, sneaking out of the palace, and with his charioteer, and he was a little more worldly than the Buddha, or Gautama Siddhartha, as he was then before he became the Buddha. And they came to a person who was sick and covered with sores and shivering, and he had never seen this before, because whenever he or anybody in the palace and the entourage in the court got sick, they were either taken away or they were cured, so he never saw it. So he asked the charioteer what was happening, and the charioteer explained to him that people and animals, everybody can get sick. So he pondered this. He had never known it before. They went back to the palace. They went out again a few weeks later, after the Buddha became more curious again, and they came across a corpse lying by the side of the road, and he was totally baffled. He'd never seen a corpse. He knew nothing of death. So he asked the charioteer what was going on, and the charioteer had to explain to him that this was something that was no longer alive, that had been, and even though it looked like a human, had been a human, a living, breathing, conscious human, he was no more. And the Buddha was shocked and surprised and didn't understand. And he asked the charioteer if that would happen to his father, and the charioteer said yes, inevitably, and to his wife, and to his son, and to him. And the fact that he would die was quite a surprise. And I think a lot of us in the West, in America, are in that situation. That is, when people get sick, I mean, here in Nepal, if you look around, you'll see people with all kinds of injuries, missing limbs, blind folk, or deaf mutes. Things that could, in the West, be very easily fixed before they became a problem. Of course, mortality rate's much higher here, much more sickness here. We don't see that. We don't have that. When we do, we'll whisk away and put her in a nice, comfortable hospital if it's bad, and so on. And we don't see death either, not like here, where it's a part of life. That is, here you sometimes see people carrying the body of a relative to the cremation grounds over at Pashupati or other places, chanting Ram Ram, Ram Ram. And the eldest son plays an important part in the cremation, that is, hits the top of the skull so that the Atma and the soul can be released. So it's kind of a visceral part of life here, unlike America, where we don't really see corpses or dead folk unless they're, they're looking beautiful, lying in their coffin. Evelyn Watt in what was his book? One of his books, The Loved One, that was made into a movie. He has a point in there, write a poem about his deceased uncle. He says, "And here you are, made up like a whore." So, yeah, so that's kind of what it's like. Lots of makeup, lots of things that we don't see that are disguised, and they're whisked away and buried or cremated, and that's that. Not like here, where we know, we're intimately familiar with mortality, with sickness, with misfortune, like that, with poverty, and that sort of suffering. As it was in the Buddhist time, only, of course, the Buddha, or the Shakyamuni Gautama didn't know it. Siddhartha Gautama didn't know about this since he had been sheltered. So this was quite a shock to him. Went back to the palace, pondered it, forgot about it for a while. But then became dissatisfied again. Went out with a charioteer one more time, and by the side of the road, there was a sadhu, a holy man, a renunciate, who was sitting and meditating, and the Buddha asked the Siddhartha Gautama asked the charioteer, "What's going on? What's that man doing?" And he says, "Well, he's living a life that he hopes will transcend death and transcend suffering." And the Buddha was shocked that there was actually a way out of all of that. So he went back to the palace and decided, he became quite dissatisfied with everything, all of his material goods, all the sensory delights that he grew up with, that he was surrounded with, the great food, the music, the women, became kind of meaningless to him because he knew that they would all evaporate. They were just not going to be there someday. He wasn't going to be there someday. That's what the AIDS epidemic was like. So, so I identified with that so much. So, of course, the rest of the story is he sneaked out of the palace one night and without anyone seeing him. He saw the women in the palace who were so beautiful. He saw them lying in awkward positions and snoring and looking not so good. And the thing that was hardest for him to leave behind was his wife and son. But he knew that he was doing it for them, and so that he could help them escape suffering and of death and birth and old age and sickness. And for the women who no longer look pretty to him, and for everybody else. We call it the altruistic wish to attain enlightenment in order to free all sentient beings from the sufferings of samsara, the bodhisattva motivation. So he went on, he studied with a couple of teachers for several years and became a renunciate and for quite a few, I think 12 years or so. The story is he lived on nothing but bird droppings and rainwater in a cave that you can see down by Bodh Gaya, the story goes. And eventually he attained enlightenment and gave his teachings to the world. And the first teaching was, I think, is the core of what Buddha Dharma is about. He gave it at a place called Sarnath, which is near Varanasi, on the Ganges in India, at the request of some of the gods and some of his fellow monks and so on, fellow renunciates. And it's what we call the Four Noble Truths, or the Four Truths for the Nobles, or the Arya Truths. And the first one is that existence is dukkha, which is usually translated as suffering. Although people who know more about Sanskrit than me say that vexation is a better term, a more accurate term, but most people say suffering when they talk about this. And there are several different kinds of it. There is the suffering of not having what we want and wanting it so badly. There's a suffering of not wanting what is visited on us and that we can't get rid of. There are a few other divisions of suffering, but the point is, in this, is that unlike, say, the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, we don't suffer because we're being punished, because God is mad at us, but because of our own actions, because it is the nature of samsara to live in suffering. That's just the way things are. It's a given, like a law of nature. And the second noble truth is that suffering is caused by attachment and aversion. That is basically, as I said, having things that we don't want, that we hate, that threaten us or make us afraid, or attachment, things that we want and don't have, things that we have and don't want to lose, that we identify with. We want them so badly. And these two things in turn arise out of what we call ignorance, which is kind of a term of art. It's a mistaken view of the way things are, which is that we're the most important thing in the world, and whatever affects us good, or in a good way, is a good thing. And if it enhances us, we love it. If it doesn't, we hate it. So that's how we judge good and bad. That's how our morality is for most people. And that's, some people call it self-clinging, and various other things. We call it marikpa in Tibetan, avidya, I think, in Sanskrit. So that's it. That's our greatest obstacle. Looking at everything through a lens of how it affects us. And the third noble truth is that there is a way out of this, and that is we can overcome suffering by overcoming attachment and aversion. And we overcome attachment and aversion by developing wisdom. This kind of wisdom, we call it wisdom realizing emptiness, which is the Buddhist view that has a couple of aspects that I'm sure all of you watching this already know this, but I'm going to tell you anyhow. That is, interdependence is one of them, or codependence, interdependent origination is one of them. That is, all phenomena are dependent on others too, and as it arises, abides, and dissolves, and nothing exists inherently, and independently, or eternally, or out of its own volition. Or since some things are easy to see, like, the water came from the ground, somebody had to make the plastic, somebody had to carry it to me, and because I'm thirsty, I love the water, and I want to drink more of it, and to satisfy my thirst. And it tastes so good. My mouth's dry from talking. So I want the water to stay here. There's only this much left, and I'm kind of concerned. So I want to cling to it. I want to keep it with me. But I'm drinking it, so it won't abide forever, and it will dissolve into my mouth and body and so on and go away. So we love it when it's arising and abiding. We hate it when it's fading away. So I'm judging this by how it quenches my thirst, because I'm not a very good Buddhist at all. So the fourth noble truth is the path that we do it. And there's several ways of looking at it. Originally it was the Eightfold Path, the right ways of doing various things. And in Vajrayana Tibetan Buddhism, we divide it down into three different things. A couple of three different things. That is, morality is one, not causing harm to others, and developing some kind of understanding, some kind of cognitive understanding of the Dharma, and then getting that deeper into our hearts and souls through meditate. Another way is hearing, contemplating, and meditating. Another way of looking at it. That is, first we come to some kind of cognitive understanding. We call it hearing because in the old days, before there was a lot of literacy, that's how wisdom or teachings were transmitted. And then contemplating it, that is, applying it to what we have heard to our own lives and our own mind and how we live our lives, and then taking it to another level, meditating on it, making it a deep thing. And so there's another kind of tripartite division to this. I'm sure you all know this, but I'm telling you anyhow. And that is that we in Vajrayana correlate to Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, which some people get off track and think that these are the chronological way things happen, but that's not really accurate. It's sort of the way that Tibetans developed this tripartite system over the years. And the first one, what we call Hinayana, or self-liberation, is when we work on ourselves, and our motivation is to end suffering for ourselves. The lowest of the low motivations, they say, is not to suffer right now. And it goes on up to not to suffer in the future and not to suffer in future lifetimes. And the middling motivations are not to be reborn, but to pass into some kind of liberation. And the highest motivation is, as I mentioned, the altruistic wish to attain enlightenment in order to free all sentient beings from the sufferings of samsara. And that's something that we strive for. It takes a long time to develop it as a motivation, especially when there are adverse circumstances that can make you lose it. But nonetheless, it becomes easier to do when we have our foundation of renunciation, that is, living a little bit separate from the world, if you're a monk, or living in the world but not quite so identifying with it, not being overwhelmed with these afflictive emotions that we all have. So that's Buddha Dharma in a nutshell.
You became a monk yourself, didn't you?
Yes, I was. I was a monk
years.
for about 25 years in America and here in Nepal and in India.
So could you say something about the deepening of your relationship with Buddhism, Buddha Dharma, and you're a lawyer in Atlanta. What are the next steps in terms of your own path?
Well,
you're starting to practice with Shambhala,
yeah,
etc., etc.
And then with the Galupas. Actually, being a lawyer in some ways was quite helpful, since the law is about compassion and so on and so forth, and about public policy. But the root of it is logic that a lot of people don't seem to know or appreciate, and you just have to apply that quite thoroughly to whatever it is that you're doing. And that's a very important part of the Buddhist pedagogical system debate, although it's a very different debate than what we do in the West. It's not the freewheeling open debate that we do there. But logic is important as a way to ground your thoughts, your beliefs, and give more substance to them. How did it go? Step by step. My teacher at the time, the Galupa Lama who was in Atlanta, I'd been practicing for a while, and he suggested that I take Getsul vows. That is, there are two kinds of monks vows, Getsul, which is sometimes called novice, which isn't really quite accurate, and Gelung vows. And he suggested I take those, and they're 10 different vows that are divided up into 37 sections. I thought he was joking, of course, but he wasn't. He was serious. He repeated it a few times, so I did. And I went on to visit. I got involved with another lineage, the Kagyu. I just happened to be, I stumbled across them, and they resonated, the teacher resonated with me. And so I became ordained in that lineage and wound up, I visited India several times for a month or so each time, and finally wound up, was in a place where I was able to live there. And I did. And, well, first here for a couple of years in Kathmandu, and then in India for 6 years in a monastery. And it was a very interesting experience. I'd never been in the military. I'd never been in an all-male environment. And of course, well, a monastery is rather different from that, but it's hierarchical, like the military is. And one of the great main differences, of course, is that for a monastery, it's like a kindness factory. That's their job. And to develop that and to spread it. The Tibetans in the old days, and some, I guess many still do, believe that the monasteries are there, they bless the entire region, and so it's important to support them. And since, I guess you could say the vibes they send out affect everybody, I think it's sort of like the space program. That is, if you ask most people, most Americans, why do we want to send people into space? What good does it do for us? And they'll say something like, oh, well, science and so on. But nonetheless, it's a basic belief that we have and that we all hold deeply and collectively. And so we have these people who are specialized in doing that, astronauts and the support systems that they have and so on. And that's what monasticism is like a lot traditionally in traditional cultures. So the monks are, well, in Buddhism, we have 3 jewels that we take refuge in: the Buddha, the Dharma, the teachings, and the Sangha. The Buddha's all the Buddhas, all the fully enlightened beings. And the Dharma is the Dharma, of course, the teachings. And the Sangha is what we call the assembly of enlightened beings, arhats and bodhisattvas. And they're represented, the Buddha is represented by statues and paintings, and the Dharma by Dharma books, and the Sangha by the monks and nuns, the assembly. And so these 3 things, or these 3 representations, are venerated and revered, not for their own sake, but because they generate, the person who's venerating them generates good karma for himself. And so, like a statue, like a book, we, the monks and nuns, are just objects of veneration. Mostly, vis-a-vis lay folk, that's the biggest job here in Asia. Most of us don't teach, we do other things in the monastery, keeping it together. But it can be an extraordinarily humbling opinion, a humbling experience, when people are depending on you for that, looking at you for that, you become that, or you strive for that. You try not to disappoint, you try to be worthy of it. That was such a great motivator on the path, on the monastic path.
Did you face any challenges in adjusting from your life as a lawyer and,
Well, it was rather gradual. There were challenges, like wearing robes in America. It was more fun than a challenge, I think. I thought about writing a book. Lay people say the darndest things. It was, cute little things like standing on the street corner once in Washington, D.C., waiting for the light to change. I looked at my watch, and the woman next to me, a complete stranger, said, "Monks aren't supposed to be concerned about time." I'm disappointed again. Or I was walking down the street in Atlanta one afternoon, and a transvestite, a drag queen or a transgender, was walking towards me, and I was wearing my robes, had a shaved head, and she just stopped in her tracks, looked me up and down and said, "You go, girl." I found out later the appropriate response would have been, "You go too." So things like that were happening constantly. Most of them were quite positive. I can remember, I can probably count the negative experiences I had as a monk, presenting as a monk, and on one hand. Yeah, people are nice, very nice. And further, unlike some people in America think, people in the rural South, in small towns, were much nicer and much more polite and much kinder, generally, as a rule, than people in the big cities in the North and elsewhere. I mean, some people are surprised because they think, urban dwellers are much more cosmopolitan, urbane, and so on, and that Southerners in the country are prejudiced rednecks, but it's not that way at all, in my experience. So, coming here, well, as I said, I'd been here several times, I think 5 or 6 times, before I started living in the monastery. So I had an idea of what I was getting into. Nonetheless, there were still quite a few things, mostly customs, and things that everybody knew, but I didn't. And there were nuances that I was missing constantly. And unlike a lot of places, there's no training film. There's no orientation. You just, you're thrown in and you pick it up. You have to ask people what to do, how to do it, what's going on, a lot. That's, I think, as far as it's one of the shortcomings in monasticism. And here in Asia, that is where, well, most people who grow up here, they kind of know they know what to expect because they grew up in this culture where monasticism is so prominent. In America, we don't. And that's one of the things that could be improved upon there. That is, when people go into it, the monastic life, it would be nice if they know what's happening, since there are so many false assumptions that people have about it. Like, very few of us know Kung Fu, for example. And even fewer can levitate. That's just how things are.
I'm curious, you were talking about when AIDS came and the terrible loss of your inner circle and many others. Also, the Cassandra dimension of the entire thing. I'm actually curious. I have 2 questions really. The first question is, how is it you think that you were able to cotton on to what was going on, Cassandra-like?
Say it again, please.
How do you think it was that you were able to cotton on, to realize that it was going to be, as you said, not just horrible but awful, when others didn't? I'm curious, that's one question. And then the second question is, and then of course you yourself were diagnosed. Going into the monastic situation, did you have to deal with that stuff, that psychological and emotional material? Can you hear me? Should I come to
Yeah, I hear, but I don't quite understand.
Well, some people might call that trauma.
Well, let's deal with the first one, then we can get on that one. Which was, how did I know what was going on?
Yeah, when so many others didn't.
Oh, well, I was editor of a gay newspaper, weekly, giveaway, and as HIV/AIDS emerged as an issue, I was getting more of that information than most people were, than probably anybody in town, those of us who worked in the paper. And it was bad news. We subscribed to the CDC's weekly morbidity and mortality report. And it was so apparent that the funds, it wasn't being funded as much as it should be. By the time that toxic shock syndrome and Legionnaire's disease and another disease that was prevalent back then or emerging back then had killed that many people total, AIDS had killed more than all three of those combined. And it was apparent that something had to be done and that nothing was going to be done. A lot of it, of course, was homophobia. There were what we call the 4-H club: homosexuals, hemophiliacs, heroin or IV drug users, and Haitians were the ones that were most well known, most associated with it at the time. And aside from hemophiliacs, we weren't the most popular folk. We were the marginalized people in society. And fortunately, gay folk came in. We were used to being marginalized. And further, we were a community in those days. We were a self-defined community. We have since, due to assimilation and progress, become a niche market, and little more than that, I think. But in those days, we had to look to each other and depend on each other for everything. There were gay doctors, gay dentists, gay merchants. Many openly gay people rarely worked for corporations, since there was only so far they could go, even if they were hired. So there were a lot of small businesses owned by gay folk. And of course, they depended on everyone's goodwill. And there was that sense of community that was happening. And also, we had just come out of several years of activism and political action, and so we kind of had a clue of what needed to happen and how to make that happen. But layered on top of that, as I mentioned, was this constant death and dying. All of one's friends, it's a horrible way to die. And in those days, as you all may know, there were no meds until I think 88 or 89, and they weren't widely available until 90. And it was a med with a lot of side effects called AZT. So there was nothing that could be done. Nothing. It made you feel incredibly helpless that not only were you probably going to die and there was nothing that could be done, but you couldn't do anything for anybody. But I hit upon something, maybe it was because I'd been an attorney, that just listening to people and letting them talk and without telling them what they should think, what they should feel, being non-judgmental like attorneys usually are, other than, advising the client as to what the law is. That was very helpful. It was probably the greatest thing that I could do for my friends, is just to listen and let them process what they had to go through. I found out later it's called active listening. But yeah, that's something I learned back then. What I learned about death and dying was about grief, that there was a rhythm to it that I could see because so many people were dying. And so I could, as I mentioned earlier, I could see emotionally what they were going through. I could see in myself what I was going through. And when people died, the grief sometimes was overwhelming. Sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes it was interesting. I could go to funerals and I could tell who had HIV or AIDS and who didn't, because usually they'd be relatives and friends who were just yelling and screaming and being very upset and crying a lot. And of course, their loved one had died. But then there would be others who just had 1,000-yard stare because we had seen it before, we'd see it again. It became banal. So they say in the West that it's very important to get in touch with our feelings and express them, and to process them in order to transcend them. In Buddhism, to the contrary, when someone dies, we're advised not to hold on and cling to the person, because it prevents their consciousness from moving on to where they have to go. It holds them back. And we're advised not to show, not to cry, not to wail and moan in grief around them, around the corpse at first, and so on. So these two conflicting things, what do you do? And what I found out the thing to do, the way I came to think about it was that, how to put it, I had to do it, but at the same time I had to not do it. And I would grieve, but not so deeply or not so overwhelmingly as I had previously, and this kind of grew a bit. And I kind of recognized that sometimes grief of a loved one, sometimes it's overwhelming, like a huge flood, and sometimes it just kind of is like a slow drip that is on you. Sometimes it's sort of like a mist, a fog that colors everything you see and perceive, but it's so very subtle that you have to really look to be aware of it, and when you do, you see it. So I learned how to experience it, not experience it. Later on, I heard a story about that Richard Gere was telling about meeting the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama was very interested in actors and acting, especially film actors, because when you act, especially in film, you have to actually call up these emotions and express them. And you actually have to feel them and manifest them in your face and your eyes, and as well as your voice, body, and so on. And he was very interested in that and how you go about doing that. That is, it became similar to that. That is to say, I knew I had to go through it, but also was watching it. Another metaphor is that was quite apt was that of a magician who, in olden times here, would entertain in crossroads. They used to do it down here in Kathmandu at the big park downtown before they closed it. That is, there would be traveling magicians who would go to crossroads or a small village, and one of his tricks would be to throw out its powder that caused people to hallucinate and to see beautiful celestial mansions and gods and so on. And people would be overawed. And the magician himself would see this too, but the difference was he knew that what was going on. He had an understanding of it. And due to this near constant death and dying and sickness for those 15 years or so, like I say, it became banal. I got to know it well. Death became my friend. Dying became my friend. I got to know them intimately. And they're not friendships I would advise cultivating, but there's something about that kind of familiarity that gives you a handle on it.
And you were quite convinced that you would die relatively soon.
Yeah, sure, of course, like everybody else that was. But I did one of nature's old tricks.
What do you make of that?
What do I make of that? Call me Ishmael. The lone survivor in Moby Dick. The only one, it seems, left to tell the tale, one of the few.
What else about that time should people know about? Or is there to say?
Good question. Don't know, really. One just has to somehow get through it. Or not. as the case may be.
So your reconciliation with that, or your dealing with that, processing that, was, it sounds like, through these this Buddhist view of grief, emotion, reality, etc. Seeing through the
There's a
illusory
practice
aspect of it.
called in which, well, there's a one of the Buddhist yidams. Manjushri is the bodhisattva of wisdom. That is what we call it wisdom realizing emptiness, but it's having a great understanding of the exact nature of things and how everything is impermanent, nothing is eternal, nothing is solid, and so on, and accepting that, learning to live with it. He has, like most of the yidams of the bodhisattvas, there's several manifestations, and his wrathful manifestation is called Yamantaka in Sanskrit, and he's said to be the most wrathful of all the wrathful deities. And he has implements in all of his arms, and when the other wrathful deities see him, they all drop their implements. They're so afraid of him. And Yamantaka is Sanskrit for conqueror of the Lord of Death, conqueror of Yama. And that got me through a lot.
Can you say more about that?
Well, I don't know that we actually conquer death, but we can conquer our fear of death. We can conquer our denial. We can conquer our anger. We can conquer our depression and everything else that we have to go through when we're in a situation like that. If we have a deep and strong enough understanding of how things are. And what was the second one that you asked?
Well, we're edging into it now, actually. I was asking how it was that you dealt with all of that, as some people would describe it these days, trauma.
Would say what?
Trauma.
Trauma, oh yeah.
Which has several layers to it. The death of all those people close to you and others. Your own Cassandra dynamic in the whole on the whole thing, which is terrible. And also your own diagnosis.
Yeah. Well, it turned out to be not so... well, when I remember very well being diagnosed or getting the test results, and I went back to my office and cut my finger on a staple, and a little drop of blood came out, and I thought, this could kill people. It didn't. Well, I hope I didn't kill anyone. But I've been sick from HIV, from AIDS, only one time, and it was a lymphoma in '99, and I saw an oncologist in Atlanta doctors, this is how you do not do bedside manner. The very first consult I had with him, he concluded with, you're in good health, you should live 3 or 4 years. I was able to get into a program at National Institutes of Health, National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, Maryland, an experimental program that for people with my kind of lymphoma, HIV-related lymphoma or AIDS-related lymphoma. And I lived more than 4 years, which was quite surprising. I thought I was going to die. Had a recurrence of it. It was this was in '99, after the meds came out, and I'd been on them for a while. And it was interesting in that when I was diagnosed and thought I was going to die, it felt like home. I'd been so used to it for so many years. Yeah. And that's kind of what happens. Well, they say, according to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross schema that when you go through all of this anger and depression and bargaining and denial, you come to eventually acceptance. I don't know how much I did. Sometimes it comes and goes, but compared to, at the time, my parents were quite old, and compared to how they were handling their imminent demise, and me and my friends were handling it, I think we were doing a better job of it. That is, we saw it all around us. As I said, it was banal, it was commonplace. They're awful things, but fear is not one of them. There are worse things than fear. It's horrible. So that's that. And as I said, I have this one AIDS-defining illness. And when you have one of them, you are said to have AIDS for life. That is, you don't go back to just merely HIV or so, whatever. And it's semantic, but there's a long story about how that evolved. It had to do with epidemiology and so on in the 80s, and how they were reckoning what AIDS was and what it wasn't. But nonetheless, I have it. I'll always have it, even though I'm healthy and my meds are great and so on. But it's like, after you have lymphoma, or the actual tumors are more or less, they're not the cancer themselves, they're some kind of tissue that the body produces. And even though I had no more cancer that I knew of, at the main site, I would still feel this phantom pain for months, years afterwards. And it was like Mr. Death was saying, you got away this time, but I'm going to get you sooner or later. And he will, but not today, not tonight.
Should we take a break?
Sure. I was in transition at the monastery. I was going to go from one to another. I'd been living in a shedra and teaching English and other things. I was going to go to another facility, but before I did, I went to America, and the COVID epidemic came, so I was trapped in America for quite some time. And living outside the monastery, I've become so accustomed to it that it didn't seem to make sense to be a monk without a monastery, along with quite a few other things. That is, the transition I was going through. And I was around a lot of old friends who were living their lay lives. And some of them had been political friends, allies, and whatnot. So that was that. There were so many things available online, teachings and practices from all over the world, any time of the day or night. So I kind of turned into a retreat, solitary retreat, since it was not advisable to leave the house at the time. So it was more like just being a renunciate, a hermit. I could have been in a cave in the remote Himalayas rather than staying in a room in the wrong side of Atlanta. So that kind of, it was more challenging too in some ways. That is, not to have the support of all of the other monks around. But on the other hand, I really did and do enjoy the freedom and less regimentation. As I said, I'd never been in the military at all, so I'd never experienced that much regimentation, that much authorities. And, you know, I'm a child of the 60s. Anti-authoritarianism is us. Yeah. So it came out. It was a learning experience. I'm glad I did it. It's time to move on.
And what do you have aspirations for the next phase of your life? Now you've been out of the monastery a few years and you're settled here in Kathmandu.
Well, I'd like to, remain innocuous to my practices. And in addition, as far as the lay support stuff goes, I'd like to work with people with HIV, especially newly diagnosed people, and especially gay men who've been newly diagnosed, since there's a great need for it here in South Asia. Gay men with HIV are, they're kind of in a double closet. That is, very few people, gay men, are out here, and homophobia is here, but it's a different kind of homophobia than in the West. It's qualitatively different, so I wouldn't get into that, but nonetheless, nobody wants to come out. And then when they are diagnosed with HIV/AIDS, some not only are not comfortable telling their gay friends if they have any, but even their families sometimes, they keep it from them, which is horrible. They're incredibly isolated often. And further, since many people here, or more people here, are unfamiliar with HIV/AIDS than in the West, many people think it's like it was 40 years ago and that their death is imminent. And that, they need help then. And they seem to be impressed. People are impressed that I've had it for about 39 years now, I guess, or diagnosed 39 years. That gives them hope just by being there. So I think I have something to offer. I have a couple of HIV/AIDS related online groups that people come across, mostly Indians. Of course, Pakistanis, South Asians, people from around the world, but that's the focus of it. And I'd like to help them get through it, because when we're diagnosed with AIDS, especially when you're relatively young, like most sexually active people are who are diagnosed, we do die. We have this notion, we all do when we're young, that we're going to live forever. And that's just the way we are. We're full of life. We can't, and especially in America, where we're not around old folks who die a lot, we think, oh yeah, we're like that. 30 is so old. I'll be dead before I'm 30, a lot of people say. Well, you won't, probably. But nonetheless, there is something that dies when you're diagnosed with HIV or any disease that you think will kill you. And what dies is the way you think of yourself. You think of yourself as young, as healthy, as the world is your oyster, as you can do anything. And then suddenly you realize someday, and someday soon, you're going to be nothing. And that takes some getting used to. You have to let that person die, and you have to give birth to another one, or transform into another one. And I like helping people with that transition. It's very, very meaningful because, of course, I feel like I'm helping myself and healing my own wounds.
What have you learned about helping people with that transition?
Mostly it's listening, just listening. And, I give information about practical things like what drugs might be better, what drugs might be worse, and healthcare and management. And there's a lot to know. It's a systemic disease, and there are all kinds of things that you really need to know to take care of yourself. And you have to. That's one of the things that happens over the years. If you don't take care of yourself, you don't do so well. So there's that. But mostly it's just listening, as I said, active listening. And I think that whistle means it's time to go.
I think you're right.
Time here is impermanent. It's no more. Most HIV meds are made by a company called Gilead. And one of the ones that they were making some time ago was called Tenofovir DF. Now there's a different formulation that's safer. But in those days, we didn't know that it caused osteopenia, osteoporosis. And I slept on some water, very simple slip and fall, and broke my right femur very badly. So much so that this leg is now 4 centimeters shorter than the other one, and will be forever. So I call this my Gilead limp. And it's probably, I mean, it's the worst result of having HIV/AIDS, and it's, you know, kind of an indirect effect, but I'd rather be limping than dead. Sunadi Tanshezi Pani Tumnene Pedadam Take Kaganachi Long twice, basically to watch it. They say in 30 years there'll be a desert.
You think so?
Kathmandu Valley.
You reckon so?
I don't know. I'm not so good at predicting the future. Would you like to know another interesting story? These. Oh no, where are they? These. Have you seen these before?
Yes, I have.
You know where they come from, where
No.
they originated? In the Andes, the Incas. And so it was part of the Hippy trail. That is, people would go down there to take, what is the word? It's become popular. In
Ayahuasca.
Yes, that's it. And other things. And so people would, you know, buy these to take home and wear them and be cool, so everybody would know how cool they were. So in addition to being cool there, they would come here and be cool. And so the people who live here, the Tibetans, Gurung and Tamang and so on, they started wearing them as well.
Were psychedelics a big part of your
Not big.
60s experience in 68 when you went to San Francisco?
Well, I tried everything at least once, because as a friend of mine said, you might not get it right the first 2 or 3 times. But, yeah, I was never really, it didn't attract me much. Acid was sort of, what was it? It just kind of made me, what is the word? Nervous, paranoid, generally. Yeah, the only one I really liked was opium, because it was so subtle and relaxing and you could let your mind flow. But fortunately, it's very rarely found in the West. So that's what saved me from a life of drug addiction, I suppose. Yeah. No, I wasn't much of a druggie. I was kind of a failure as a hippie.
When you became a lawyer, I suppose.
Yeah, might as well. So I defended people who were druggies. A lot. The law firm that I worked with, the Legal Collective, was my first law job, and it was, like I said, there were people who, they're really unsung heroes. A lot of them did the litigation that implemented the Great Society and the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 63, I think it was. And they did so much, and they gave so much, and many of them, or at least the ones I worked with, also made a career out of representing drug dealers, big-time drug dealers who had a lot of money and could afford it. And so basically, that paid for the civil rights litigation that we did that was not remunerative at all.
So you were telling me before that you often come to the stupa almost every day.
Yeah.
What's your regime then when you come here?
I just walk around and say mantras.
What kind of mantras do you say? I mean, you in particular.
I say, I keep forgetting I don't have to look at you.
Yeah, it's okay.
Well, I say the mantras of my main practice. And also, Om Mani Padme Hum, the mantra of Chinrezig or Avalokiteshvara, who is the most practiced yidam are in Vajrayana in Tibet and Tibet Buddhism. He's said to be the bodhisattva of compassion, who is a manifestation of all the compassion of all the Buddhas and bodhisattvas. But he's also, the thing about that is, well, compassion we define as the wish that all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And conjoined with that is what we call wisdom realizing emptiness. So the idea, the goal of practice could be summed up as the union of those two things and realizing them deeply. That is, knowing that there's subject and object, like I feel compassion for you, or try to, and which is important. However, at the same time, that compassion is dependently arisen, since if I weren't here, I wouldn't be feeling compassion for you. If you weren't here, either in the flesh or in my brain, it wouldn't be existing. It would be empty. It would not happen. And the act of it is the third leg of this tripartite system that makes it happen. So we have to, ideally, realize both of those at the same time. And it takes a while, a few lifetimes, to get it down. Oh, Mani Padme, Mani Padme, Mani Padme Hum. Oh, Mani Padme Hum, Mani Padme Hum. Oh, Mani Padme Hum, Mani Padme Hum, Mani Padme Hum. Mani Padme, Mani Padme Hum. Mani Padme, Mani Padme Hum. Mani Padme, Mani Padme, Mani Padme, Mani Padme, Mani Padme, Mani Padme. Barbara, Sal, Padme, Mani Padme. What's the Dorje, Sminty on the face? So, she also brought us one. Hey, we'll be the kitty, so how much? Hey, we'll be the kitty, Dorje, so much. Oh no, she has so much fun. So, somebody so hot today. I was at a retreat once, and in the mountains in North Georgia. And we were meditating learning what we call the four measurables. And one of them is to generate compassion. Well, for those who have helped you, those who are neutral, and those who have harmed you. And it helps to actually bring to mind someone in your life who has done this, who fits these categories and develop compassion, loving kindness, equanimity for them. So the one I fixed on was this fellow who I'd been doing politics with. He was a gay man. And we didn't get along at all, to say the least. He was rather conservative, and he really didn't understand the way advocacy works, and kind of had this idea that if you were respectable enough, everything would fall into place. And it doesn't. There's a lot of work, a lot of thinking that goes on. And I was more of a free spirit, still am. So he would do things that were really quite horrible, I guess is the word, that would frustrate me, and some of them were rather personal. So I took him as the object of someone who has harmed me. And so I would try to generate compassion for him. And we have all of these ways to do that, such as thinking of everybody as having been our mother at some time in our countless millions of lives and the billions of universes that we've been through, and who took care of us and nurtured us and carried us in her stomach and did all kinds of horrible things to protect us because she loved us so much. And when people who are harming us, we think of them as having, because of their past karma, they now have these afflictive emotions that's clouding their vision, and that is what's causing them to act out in these ways and express these harmful afflictive emotions that hurt us. And so we try to develop some kind of feeling. Hush, I'm being interviewed. We try to develop some kind of feeling, even for barking dogs who are getting in the way of my exposition. So he was the one I chose. And sometimes it was work. Sometimes I could go for as long as 15 minutes without getting pissed off all over again about what he did. And so the retreat was for a weekend. I went home. Monday morning, I was eating breakfast, reading the newspaper. We had newspapers back then. And there was his obituary. He was not even in existence in this life as we know it. He was right here. It was something I was carrying around in my head. So the way I was feeling about him was like, you know, if he was alive, I'd be upset with him. But he wasn't. Nonetheless, he was, this is my new friend, I suppose. Nima. Acha. Nga country Dorje. Kerangi Gampa got it, eh? Yeah. So that's about all I have to say. Good luck, folks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.